do need to go here. I haven't switched the current next week pointers yet. I would normally do that before class, but I have other issues going on here. We'll get to that. But I haven't quite finished talking about the heart stuff, so I want to go into the heart chapter and point out some things. Did I talk about the cardiac cycle, the heartbeat last time?
Yeah,
You did that little
No.
exercise online when it starts.
That's right. Okay. Then the answer to what I just asked is actually no. Because if you go into, whoops, wrong one. If you go into the heart chapter, there's a section. So that stuff that you just said I did is in the electrical activity section. The next part is called the cardiac cycle. So I don't think I did this. And you would know it if you'd seen this picture before. Okay, good. The cardiac cycle is basically the heartbeat. And this little circle describes what's happening over the course of a heartbeat. I'm just going to say a few things about this quickly. I went into it in more depth in the lecture I just recorded, so hopefully that'll post and you can hear a little bit more of my explanation. But two terms that are in this figure, and I want to introduce you to, are systole and diastole. Systole basically means contraction, and diastole means relaxation. So when we're talking about the heart muscle, it's either contracted or it's relaxed. And when it's contracted, it's in systole. It maintains contraction for a certain amount of time, and then it relaxes, and then it goes back into contraction. So in this figure, and let me enlarge it for a sec, it's basically pointing out the different phases of the cardiac cycle. The inner circle is describing what's happening in the atrium, which is kind of the minor part of what's going on here. And then the outer circle is describing what's happening in the ventricles, which is what we're really most concerned about. Atrial systole, when the atria are contracting, is happening during this part of the cycle. And then the rest of the cycle, the atria are in diastole. Okay, that represents about 100 milliseconds of time. So, atrial systole there represents about 100 milliseconds of time. That's the time between the start of the P wave and the QRS complex, when the atria are depolarized and contracting. It's about 100 milliseconds. So they contract for that period of time, and then the rest of the heartbeat, they're relaxed. They're in diastole. In the ventricles, ventricular systole is that big sort of third of the picture that's in green, meaning that that's when the ventricles are contracting. And then the rest of the time, the other 2/3 of the time, it's in diastole, it's relaxed. There's a little white thing that looks like a start button down there in the bottom corner. That's actually in the wrong place. We usually think of starting the cycle right here at the beginning of atrial systole. So if we drew a line out on the circle here, and we just follow the circle around, that's one heartbeat. We start at the beginning of atrial systole because that's caused by the SA node firing, and the P wave is the beginning of that. So that's where the P wave fires off, and there's a little EKG trace up in the top there, and the P wave is in purple to represent that's what's going on at that point. And it stays contracted for about 100 milliseconds, and it's pushing what blood there is in the atria down into the ventricles through the AV valves. At the end of that, all of the blood that can be pushed out has been pushed out, and the ventricles are as full as they're going to get. The full ventricles then push back against the valves, and the valves close. We switch from atrial systole to ventricular systole at that point. So the AV valves closing and the switch from atrial to ventricular systole, all that's kind of happening at the same time. This is all coordinated because of the cardiac conduction pathway. The signal slows down going through the AV node and the AV bundle because those fibers are smaller, and so that it doesn't start ventricular contraction until atrial contraction is over. And so when ventricular contraction starts in the EKG, we see the QRS complex. So that's what's in purple in the little trace up above in that corner. Within the ventricular systole, there's actually two things going on. Okay. In the picture, the way this has to be drawn, they have these little heart cartoons there, and it looks like they're, taking up equal amounts of time within that stretch. But in fact, the first thing represented by the first picture there is very brief. It's probably a few milliseconds long. And the title up in the corner there, this right here, enlarge it. It says isovolumetric contraction. Now in the book, they have these two words, isovolumic and isovolumetric, because there are sort of two ways of saying it, but they mean the same thing, which is that the volume of blood in the ventricles is the same. The AV valves are open right here and they close. So these valves are closed. The semilunar valves are closed also. So at that point, all of the valves are closed, no blood can get in, no blood can get out. So it's isovolumetric. And we've started ventricular systole, so we've got ventricular contraction. So it's isovolumetric contraction. This happens, again, very briefly, because as the ventricular wall contracts, it starts exerting pressure on the blood there. And the pressure has to get high enough to push the semilunar valves open. It does that within a few milliseconds. Okay. So that's a very brief time. And then the rest of the time, the semilunar valves open, the ventricles are contracting, and it's pushing blood out, ejecting blood from the ventricles into the aorta, or arteries. And so the rest of it, what the second picture of the heart there is called, is ventricular ejection. And it just shows arrows with the blood moving out through the center of the valves. While the two pictures look like they're about equal components of that, really the first thing is a few milliseconds and the rest of it is 260 some odd milliseconds. The whole thing is about 270 milliseconds. That's how long the cardiac muscle action potential lasts and how long contraction lasts for a ventricular myocardial cell, about 270 seconds. And there are pictures. I showed you did I show you the cardiac action potential pictures last time with the plateau? Talked about calcium. You guys didn't tell me what calcium does for a long time. Remember that? Uncomfortable silence. I know there's a lot of them and you can't take them straight, but right? Okay. That's what's happening there, about 270 milliseconds. Okay. And then when that contraction's over, the pressure of blood in the aorta or the artery is high enough to push back against the semilunar valve and closes it. Okay. Not all of the blood gets ejected. Okay. For all of the blood to be ejected, then the ventricle would have to completely collapse to nothing. And there's always a little bit of space in there, so there's always a little bit of blood. But most of it gets ejected. And when systole ends, when contraction ends, the semilunar valve closes. Okay. Then we move into the next period, which doesn't have a formal name exactly here. All of the light green there is ventricular diastole, but really what we're talking about is the beginning of ventricular diastole until the start of the next heartbeat, which is atrial systole. Okay. So again, if we drew a line from the start of atrial systole up, that's the beginning point for the cycle. It's obviously also going to be the end point for the cycle. So from this point around to that point, all of that, I prefer to refer that as the relaxation period. I don't call it ventricular diastole because ventricular diastole lasts longer than that. I don't call it atrial diastole because atrial diastole started about 270 milliseconds earlier. But it's when both pairs of chambers are relaxed or in diastole. So it's relaxation period for the whole heart. Everything is relaxed. It starts off with isovolumetric relaxation, which means the AV valves are still closed from the end of atrial systole, and the semilunar valves just closed at the end of ventricular systole. So everything's closed again. No blood gets in, no blood gets out, isovolumetric. But the ventricular walls are now relaxing. Again, that happens very, very rapidly. Handful of microseconds. And then the rest of the time is spent in what the second picture there shows, which is this picture here, which is ventricular filling. Once the pressure in the ventricles drops, then blood in the atria can push through the AV valve again, and it'll start filling the ventricles. The ventricles actually fill mostly during that time. About 70% of the blood that goes into the ventricles gets there in that part of the relaxation period. And then when we start atrial diastole, the atrial walls contract and push the last little bit, about 30% of what's going to end up in the ventricles gets there then. The ventricular filling part right here is a passive filling. The heart's all completely relaxed. There's no energy expended by the heart at that point to push the blood in there. And then when we go over to atrial systole, then energy is spent contracting and pushing the last bit of blood in it. Okay. So aside from the isovolumetric relaxation, again, just a handful of milliseconds, when all of the valves are closed, the rest of the time here during ventricular diastole, which is the rest of the cycle and the beginning of the next cycle, that's when the ventricles are getting all their blood. Ventricular filling is a passive aspect of that when everything's relaxed. And then the atrial systole is the active part that pushes the last bit of the blood into the ventricles. So that's the events of the cardiac cycle, what the heart is doing throughout. We consider there are 5 different things that are happening. Atrial systole, where we start, and then isovolumetric contraction and ventricular ejection, which is ventricular systole, and then isovolumetric relaxation and ventricular filling, which is the relaxation period. Atrial systole is kind of its own thing, but if we compare the other 4 pictures of the heart, we have isovolumetric contraction and isovolumetric relaxation, kind of the same thing in reverse. And we have ventricular ejection and ventricular filling, which are kind of the opposites of each other there too. Okay, so those 4 kind of mirror each other. All the valves are closed and pressure builds up until the blood's ejected. And then all the valves are closed and pressure drops until blood starts filling the ventricle again. So those 4 pictures of the heart kind of represent mirror images of what's happening in the ventricles. And then we just got the atrial systole part where the atria are doing their thing. That's all the atria do. The cardiac cycle. Questions about that? I'll take that as a no. So as we go through here, it describes some of this. It talks about pressure and blood flow, which basically means it's sort of a law of fluid dynamics. Any fluid is going to move from high pressure to low pressure. And I use the word fluid specifically because that includes liquids and gases as far as we're concerned. Here we're talking about it in terms of blood moving through the circulatory system. When we get to the respiratory system, the same concept's going to apply as air is moving from high to low pressure, okay, or gases are moving from high to low pressure. So that's kind of what that's getting at. And then it talks about the different phases there. And And then this picture relates the cycle a little bit more directly to, and it'll come up in a second. There we go. The EKG. So the gray bar at the bottom is the cardiac cycle. Okay. And so that shows us it begins here at atrial systole and it runs through ventricular systole, and then when everything's relaxed in the relaxation period. And here is the end of the relaxation period from the previous cycle, just sort of overlapping. The P wave lines up with the start of atrial systole. The QRS complex lines up with the start of ventricular systole. The T wave lines up with the end of ventricular systole. Okay. The end of atrial systole occurs at the same time as the start of ventricular systole because the electrical activity representing repolarization of the atria is sort of buried inside the QRS complex. So that kind of all lines up there, relating it back to the electrical stuff. Now, I'd kind of like it if the two bars there representing the cardiac cycle were included in the next picture, but they didn't do it that way. So if we go down here, we have this other picture, and pretend that at the top we have that that cardiac cycle thing. This point right here would line up with the start of atrial systole, and this point right here would be where we switch from atrial systole to ventricular systole. And then this point right here would be where we switch from ventricular systole to relaxation, which plays out until we start the next cardiac cycle here. Okay. Which is to say, we can really map all that stuff right on here. This is showing the pressures that we would find in 3 different locations. The pressure in the atrium, the pressure in the ventricle, and the pressure in the aorta. Now, really, we're talking just about the left side. So it's a pressure in the left atrium, the pressure in the left ventricle, and then the aorta is the artery associated with the left side of the heart. In the right side, conceptually the same thing's happening, but the pressure is much lower because that's pumping for pulmonary circulation. This is pumping for systemic circulation. But everything that's happening here basically happens on the right side, just the pressures are much lower. Pressures measured in millimeters of mercury, which is kind of an outdated unit because we don't actually use mercury to measure that anymore. But it's based on the idea that a column of mercury in a glass tube that's marked with a millimeter ruler, the pressure acting on that mercury will make it change its volume, and it will rise up the column that we can measure in millimeters. So how many millimeters of mercury we see on the column is a direct measurement of the pressure in the system. That's where it comes from. Nowadays, of course, that's all done digitally, but we still use that unit. And so when you see millimeters of mercury, that's just what it's talking about. We'll talk about a couple of other ways to express pressure when we get to the respiratory system, because you can talk about air pressure using a couple of other things, but especially when we're talking about the blood, millimeters of mercury is where we go with that. Each of these lines represents one of those things and the variation in pressure we see throughout the cardiac cycle. If we're comparing two things like the atrium and the ventricle, blood's going to move from higher to lower pressure, even with a small difference like that. Okay? And then whenever we see two lines crossing over, that means that the pressures are changing and one pressure becomes higher than the other. Where that happens is always where a valve closes or opens. Okay? So when the ventricular pressure gets to be higher than the atrial pressure, the AV valve closes because the ventricular pressure pushes back against the valve and closes it. This bump right here represents atrial systole. So the atrial pressure goes up as the atria contract, and along with that, the ventricular pressure rises in a very similar arc because as the blood's being added to the system, to the ventricle, the pressure in there is going to go up too, until the ventricular pressure equals atrial pressure and crosses over, and it pushes back and closes the valve. And then that's when atrial systole ends and ventricular systole begins. So as the ventricular wall starts to contract, pressure builds up very, very rapidly. And it brings the pressure up until it's equal to aortic pressure. And that's when the semilunar valves open, because the pressure in the ventricle is now high enough to push the semilunar valve open and push blood out into the aorta. Now, every textbook that shows this sort of picture has the exact same problem in it, which could be fixed, but there's a reason that it isn't, because people are kind of too lazy. These three lines are drawn in a graphics program using a certain type of mathematics to define the curves. And in those drawing programs, you don't put in different numbers to change the curves. It has a little slider attached to it, and you can bend the curve however you want to. But when you do that, the whole curve bends. Okay? So they drew this curve here, the green line, and they drew this curve here, the red line. And if you took enough time and you futzed with it enough, you could get them to be complementary to each other. But no book have I ever seen that they actually went so far to do that, because the graphic designer probably gets to the point where they say, it's good enough. Okay, if you want me to do it better, you got to pay me more, something like that. Whatever. Which is to say, the green line really should be above the red line throughout this entire curve, and they shouldn't cross over until right here, which is where the semilunar valve closes. From when the semilunar valve opens over here until it closes over here, the pressure in the ventricle should be higher than the pressure in the aorta, meaning that ventricular ejection is taking place. Okay. And then after the semilunar valves close and the AV valves are still closed from over here, we're back into isovolumetric country, and the pressure is dropping rapidly because this is where ventricular systole ends and ventricular diastole begins. So the ventricles relax and pressure drops very rapidly until it drops below atrial pressure, and the AV valves open because the atrial pressure can push back through those valves again. And then the yellow line stays above the green line here because this is passive ventricular filling, and then the active filling of atrial systole of the next cardiac cycle. Now notice that these two curves here aren't exactly the same shape as these two curves over here. Again, because of how the programs draw curves, they never get them quite exact. But the same thing happening here is happening over here. Okay? And also, these curves here don't line up the way they're supposed to. And I can just imagine the graphic designer trying to get it to work right, and it never quite did it. But pretend that green line right there is actually above the red line until that point right there. So pressure differential is always going to drive things. But you got to think about the anatomy of the system. Okay, atria are next to ventricles. So we're going to have blood moving from the atrium into the ventricles. And then the ventricle gets filled, and then it moves blood from the ventricle into the aorta. Now, the aortic pressure is higher than the atrial pressure, but the anatomy in the heart means that the aorta is not going to feed into the left atrium. Okay. It does, but the blood coming out of the aorta then moves into the rest of systemic circulation and travels all throughout the body. And if we could follow that red line around representing the entire systemic circulation, it would end coming in, the pressure in the vena cava would be way down here. Okay, as blood moves away from the heart through systemic circulation, the pressure that's generated with the heartbeat falls off, and then finally it gets down to the end of systemic circulation, and the pressure's almost to zero, but just barely high enough that the blood will keep moving into the ventricles. But really, in the ventricles, the pressure is pretty much zero, and that's, since the AV valve's open, really the end of the line. So the pressure is just enough to get the blood moving all the way through the system from the aorta back through the atria into the ventricle again. Okay, and then the valves close, the ventricle pressure goes up, and it pushes the blood out for another circuit through the system, the circulation. That's kind of a quick trip through what these graphs show about pressure, but I think I've hit all the major explanations. Any questions about what I just described? Yes.
That sounds. Does it line up with the opening?
Right. So actually, if you pay attention to the question I just asked, I said any questions about what I just described, because I realized I forgot to say that. But so I do want to explain that, but I forgot to set it up. Any other questions about stuff? Okay, so what I forgot to mention, and I always do because I kind of get past it, when the valves close, when the AV valve closes or the semilunar valve closes, there's a bump in pressure in the location behind the valve. Okay. So the AV valve closes and pressure in the atrium bumps for a second. The semilunar valve closes and the pressure in the aorta bumps for a second. Okay. Now, oh, can't quite see it there, but you can see on that door over there, it's got a closing mechanism so that I can't slam the door. So, and there's, oh, actually not one there, but if I slam that door, the class next door would probably be kind of upset. So let's pretend neither of them can be slammed so I don't actually do it and piss somebody off. But I always do this in the lecture room, and it's true in the lecture room. I can't slam any doors there. If I were to slam a door in your face, okay, we'll assume you're standing far back enough that I'm not going to actually hit you with the slamming door. But if you're on the receiving end of the slam, if you're out in the hallway and I slam that door, what are you going to feel?
How fast?
Sorry?
You get nervous or something like that?
No, what are you physically going to feel when I slam the door?
Vibration.
Little wind, air that the door is pushing, okay? When the valves close, the same idea. They push back on, you don't believe me? I'll go stand by the door. I'll give you a demonstration. No. Really, I mean, it's a big, you know, what is that? 7 foot high, 3.5 foot wide piece of wood, roughly. If I move it quickly, it's going to push the air in front of it, okay? And you're going to feel that air pushing against you. And that's what's happening with the blood. When the valves are closing, they push back against the blood, and so the pressure here rises just momentarily, okay? In the aorta or in the atrium. Those bumps line up with these sounds down here, because what you're hearing is the sound of the blood, the liquid, that's moving there, okay? It's a little whooshing sound in the blood. So the traditional way of describing the heartbeat is lub-dub. Lub really is, it's the first heart sound, and it's when the AV valves close. And then dub is the second heart sound, and it's when the semilunar valves close. There are other heart sounds. Some sources will actually have a third and a fourth. But in this little audio representation, the third, and if there were a fourth, the fourth one, would be much smaller than the size of the first or the second ones. And we usually don't even think about those other sounds because they're so faint, some people don't even hear them. But they're going to be related to other aspects of blood moving through the heart. If you hear sounds other than the ones that are expected, we usually refer to that as a murmur. And that's just blood moving through the heart somewhere, making some noise when it's not supposed to. Between this spot here and this spot here, the blood's not making a noise that we can hear because it's moving sort of the way it's supposed to. There's nothing really interfering with it. It's when the valves close that the blood flow is suddenly changed, and we hear that kind of thing. If you hear sounds elsewhere, those are murmurs. The probably most common example of a murmur is one that is heard when blood moves from one atrium to the other. Okay. Now, in the fetal heart, the right and left atria are actually connected. There's a hole between the two. Because in fetal circulation, the pulmonary circuit is meaningless because in gestation, the fetus is not breathing. There's no air coming into the lungs. So oxygen gets into the fetal blood through the placenta, through the delivery from the maternal blood. So the atria are actually connected directly to each other so that blood bypasses the pulmonary circuit for the most part. Not completely. Some blood needs to go to the lungs anyways, but most of it just gets shunted from the left side to the right side. Nope, sorry, right side to left side. Whatever. It goes from one side to the other, and it never bothers going through the lungs completely. When somebody's born, that hole closes up. Okay. When the hole doesn't close completely, you can hear a sound from the blood rushing through that hole in the middle of a heartbeat, and that's a type of a murmur. That's not the only thing that causes murmurs, but that's a common example. It's called an atrial septal defect, which sometimes is benign and closes on its own. Sometimes hearts just take a little longer to close that hole off. And so the newborn might have a hole there once they start using their pulmonary circuit anyways, and it'll eventually close up. Some people, it never completely closes because it's a problem with development, and they'll have that for a long time. They might have to be closed surgically. I was born with one. I had mine closed by a doctor going into my heart, cutting open the heart, open heart surgery, and stitching everything back together, putting a little piece of tissue over the hole. Nowadays, it's actually done by catheter. Catheter's inserted in through a vein to the vena cava to the right atrium, and then the tip of the catheter goes through the atrial septal defect, and on the end of the catheter are these two things that are kind of like umbrellas, and they open up, one on either side of the septum, and then they're closed, and so it sort of seals off the atrial septal defect. Okay. I think this is really cool, but I'm kind of a big nerd as far as cardiology is concerned. But when a doctor explained that to me not too long ago, because they were afraid that mine actually didn't heal up properly, I was like, "Ooh, that'd be really cool." But I didn't want to have the surgery. I mean, the catheterization anyways. But if it was necessary, it would have really been cool to have that done. Turns out mine did, in fact, heal perfectly fine. But that can be done. Yeah.
What are the umbrella things made of?
Some sort of plastic. I don't know exactly what, but if somebody's having a shunt put in or a stent put in, that sort of thing, that kind of biomedical grade plastic, I'm sure. It's got to be something very flexible because it's going to be closed as it goes in, and it pops open and they close it. But yeah. And that's kind of a side point, but back to your question originally, actually, the heart sounds that we hear here are because blood's moving thanks to the closing valves here. We hear that little whoosh. Other heart sounds are related to other movements of blood. There are a couple of other minor ones that most people don't pay attention to, but things that aren't normal are usually referred to as murmurs. So, and then that whole sideline about atrial septal defects.
I don't mind. I have like a minor one. A minor one myself.
Yeah, and probably there are people that have murmurs that you can hear, but it doesn't really affect cardiac function too much. So it's more trouble to try to fix it than get into it. So, but it's probably something that they're watching in case in the future something changes and gets worse, they need to go in. So whatever might be causing it. Sometimes it's a valve that doesn't close completely, something like that. And if there's just a little bit of problem with the valve closing completely, it's not a big problem, but that can develop worse and worse. And when the valves don't close, then blood doesn't pump through correctly. You might have to have a valve replaced or something like that. So, anyways, so that's looking at the different pressures. Questions about that? Heart sounds good. Okay. To listen to the heart, there's sort of 4 specific places you can listen. Each one is best to listen to a particular valve itself, which is sort of laid out here. Okay. And if you're interested in that, you can look at it a bit more. The next section is called cardiac physiology. And by that, we really mean considering the way that the heart works and how we quantify that. And we do that through what's called cardiac output. Okay? Cardiac output is mathematically defined as the heart rate times what's called stroke volume. Okay? And let me enlarge this picture. Okay. Stroke volume. Stroke volume is the difference between 2 values called EDV and ESV. EDV means end diastolic volume. ESV means end systolic volume. This is the volume in the ventricle at those 2 time points. End diastolic volume, the end of ventricular diastole, means when the ventricle is as full as it can be. And then end systolic volume is at the end of ventricular systole and after the ventricle has ejected all of the blood it possibly can. Okay. And so the difference there is just the difference between the fullest a ventricle can be and the emptiest it is after it's contracted. Okay. Now these 2 values here, they each have their own units. Heart rate is beats per minute, and stroke volume is measured in milliliters of blood per heartbeat. So when you multiply those 2 together, HR times SV, let me just put this here so we can talk about it. Heart rate is beats per minute. And if you multiply that by milliliters per beat, then the result is going to be milliliters per minute. Okay, see how that works out? Beats in the numerator for heart rate and beats in the denominator for stroke volume cancel out. So you get milliliters per minute. Everybody see that? Okay. Now, let's say your resting heart rate is 75 beats per minute. And you multiply that by this kind of standard stroke volume, which is 75 milliliters per beat. Okay. And so that comes out to roughly 5,000 milliliters per minute. Okay. It's like 5,350 or something like that. I don't care. Because those numbers are very average, and so the exact number doesn't really matter. Point is, about average for resting cardiac output is 5,000 milliliters per minute, or we could say that just as easily 5 liters per minute. On average, you have about 5 liters of blood in your body. So that suggests that resting cardiac output is basically moving all of the blood in your body through your heart every minute. That's not exactly what it's about. It just happens to be that the volumes are about the same. But if you're a smaller person and your blood volume's lower, but your resting cardiac output is in this range, then if you have 4 liters of blood, that doesn't mean that your resting cardiac output is going to be 4 liters per minute. It might still be 5 liters per minute. There's not really any connection there. I'm just pointing out that that's kind of the average amount of blood that anybody has in their body. Yeah.
Yeah, when they do this equation, is that with respect to ejection fraction, or is it just kind of like a general equation irrespective of that?
Ejection fraction is going to come away from where this is, because this is using stroke volume. Okay. Now let me talk actually about ejection fraction. Which can be abbreviated EF. This is stroke volume divided by end diastolic volume. Now, stroke volume is the difference between end diastolic volume and systolic volume. It's the amount of blood that you eject. So ejection fraction is the fraction or the ratio of what's ejected versus the total volume. Okay? And it's expressed as a percentage. Okay, so if stroke volume is 70 milliliters per beat, and end diastolic volume is, let me think about this for a second. I think the normal is about 120 or something like that milliliters. Sorry. Stroke volume, here we don't really care about that it's per beat, but rather that in that beat, 70 milliliters is ejected. The end diastolic volume was 120, so the ratio there is just dividing 70 by 120, which should be, and I'm not going to worry about how exact the math is, but it should be about 55 to 60%, okay, roughly, maybe 65. That's kind of the average range. Low ejection fraction, meaning that not a whole lot is ejected of what's in the ventricle, is a sign that the ventricle's not performing most efficiently. I'm actually familiar with ejection fraction because I have heart problems. My ejection fraction is about 35%. And that's because I said earlier I had this atrial septal defect. It was repaired with surgery. I also had a problem with my tricuspid valve. So both of those were affected in surgery together. And in doing that surgery, there's some scar tissue in my heart. Okay? And so because part of my ventricular wall is compromised by scar tissue, it doesn't beat efficiently. It's kind of like I had a heart attack, but I didn't actually have a heart attack. I just have some scar tissue, some compromised myocardium. And so my ventricles don't contract as well as they should. So they get filled up with blood, but then when they contract, they don't eject as much as they should. So I have a low ejection fraction. So anyways, that's what ejection fraction is. And I went off on that sideline because Logan wanted to ask about that. But your question actually originally was, does the cardiac output have anything to do with ejection fraction? And the answer to that is no. And the reason why the answer to that is no is that ejection fraction is really a normalization of stroke volume. Let's say my stroke volume is 45 milliliters, okay? And my end diastolic volume is 120. I don't know if that actually works out mathematically, but let's pretend those are the numbers. If there was somebody else and their stroke volume were 55, but their end diastolic volume was 185, okay, we might have the same ejection fraction, but the stroke volumes are obviously different numbers. So you couldn't say somebody with a higher stroke volume has a better functioning heart, because you have to know what the end diastolic volume is also. Okay? So the ejection fraction normalizes those values, those milliliters, based on the individual heart anatomy and normalizes it for everybody. Okay. Now, I have very little in common with a former, very conservative, warmongering vice president. Okay. But we have the same ejection fraction. Okay. Back in 2004, Dick Cheney went through a series of heart attacks, and so when you're worrying about who you're electing to be the next president and possibly the person that might succeed him if he dies, then suffering a series of heart attacks is news. And so in the news, they said that he had an ejection fraction of 35, which should have scared the hell out of a lot of people, and they shouldn't have elected him. But there's other reasons why they shouldn't have elected him too. But this news kind of spun it by saying that instead of saying that he has congestive heart failure, which he does. And having an ejection fraction of 35% basically means you have congestive heart failure. So, okay, we're really going off on a tangent here with ejection fraction. Any questions about ejection fraction? Okay, so let me get rid of that because we want to go back to talking about cardiac output. I'm going to put that in here. So HR times SV is the mathematical definition of cardiac output. It is the beats per minute times the milliliters per beat, giving us a final volume of value in volume per minute, milliliters per minute, which for resting cardiac output for most people, that would be 5,000 milliliters per minute, so 5 liters per minute is fine. Now, if we want the heart to work harder, we want better cardiac output, we want it to pump more blood through our body, we can affect that by changing heart rate or changing stroke volume. And heart rate is really under the control of the autonomic system. The sympathetic system increases heart rate, so sympathetic activity will increase cardiac output. The parasympathetic system will lower cardiac output. Now, we don't really talk about lowering cardiac output beyond resting cardiac output, but resting cardiac output is where it is because the resting heart rate is based on parasympathetic activity. Okay. But besides the autonomic system, which is the main thing in charge of that, there are definitely hormones that can affect heart rate. Epinephrine, which really is just an extension of autonomic innervation, will do it. But thyroid hormones, T3 and T4 will do it. I think glucagon actually does it too. Why, I'm not sure. Maybe not glucagon. Something else does it. There's some other weird hormone that actually raises heart rate. Fitness levels can have an effect. As somebody becomes more physically fit, their cardiovascular efficiency improves. And actually, somebody who's really fit will tend to have a lower heart rate at rest. A marathon runner probably has a resting heart rate closer to 60 beats per minute. And then as people age, their heart rate can change too. But I want to get back to that fitness thing. Resting heart rate for a well-trained athlete is usually pretty low. Their cardiac output, resting cardiac output, is going to be pretty average probably. Because also the fitness level can affect stroke volume. And so when somebody's very physically fit, their heart beats very well. And so they beat more with each beat, more blood is ejected. So the stroke volume is higher, the heart rate is lower. And that's going to keep cardiac output at sort of the average level. But because heart rate's lower, when somebody is physically fit, needs more cardiac output because they're performing in whatever activity they happen to do, this number can increase a lot more than in a normal person. And so cardiac output can increase a lot more. If we consider the range that's capable for these values, cardiac output can go from rest to maximal output. For your average person, that's usually about 4 times. So if resting cardiac output is 5 liters per minute, then for your average person, it can go up to 15 to 20 liters per minute. Okay. But somebody who's in really good physical fitness, their cardiac output can go up quite a bit more. So they can go up to 35 to 45 liters per minute. So that's about 7 times more. Okay. It's a range, but roughly 7. And part of that comes from the fact that the change that they can get in heart rate, since they start lower, can be higher. Okay. Oh, actually, let me talk about age for a second. Everybody has a maximal heart rate. And the rule of thumb for that, if you do any kind of cardio work, you probably are aware of this. The rule of thumb is maximal heart rate is 220 beats per minute minus your age, which doesn't mean every year on your birthday your heart slows down by 1 beat per minute. It really just means that a newborn can have a maximal heart rate of about 220. 20-year-old, it's going to be more like 200. 40-year-old, more like 180. 60-year-old, 160, et cetera, et cetera. So maximal heart rate goes down with age. Resting heart rate doesn't necessarily go down with age quite as dramatically, but it might go down a little bit too. Okay. Now, stroke volume is based on a number of things that I do want to talk about for a second. But I've already talked about fitness level, kind of. I just said that it has an effect. I'm not going to say any more about that other than it does. Heart size can have an effect because stroke volume is the difference in volumes in the heart. So a bigger heart is going to have bigger ventricles and therefore greater end diastolic volume. Okay. And systolic volume isn't necessarily going to change so directly with heart rate because it depends on how much is ejected. There are some conditions where heart size is enlarged, and that's a bad thing. Okay. Now, we all know from the Grinch that cardiac myopathy is a good thing. Cardiac, not myopathy, cardiac, shoot. There's a term for when your heart gets too big. And I've suddenly blanked on it. What?
Yeah, cardiomyopathy, your enlargement of the ventricle.
No, because there's, what? Yeah, that's what I was going for. There's part of the word that specifically means large. So it's mega meaning big. So how'd you pronounce it?
I said megaly, but
Cardiomegaly.
Megaly?
I just know how to spell it. 'cause I
Yeah,
tried.
okay. So yeah, the mega there means that the heart's getting big. So if you're a Grinch, that's a good thing. But actually, in something like congestive heart failure, since the heart's not working very well, it fills with blood and that stretches the heart out, which increases end diastolic volume. But that can sometimes be bad. Gender has an effect too, and that's just basically sexual dimorphism. Men just generally have larger bodies, more muscle mass, so they're going to have larger hearts to pump more oxygen to that muscle mass, and so women are going to tend to have smaller hearts. But when we talk about sexual dimorphism in humans, it's usually not that big of a difference, no pun intended. But like if you think about, say, seahorses, okay, female seahorses are big, not necessarily that big, but let's say this is how big a female seahorse is. A male seahorse is going to be a lot smaller. That's real sexual dimorphism. Or gorillas. Male gorillas are huge, 800 pounds, whatever. Female gorillas are going to be smaller, 500 pounds, whatever. Humans just don't have that big of sexual dimorphism going on. But there is some, and it's largely due to testosterone increasing muscle mass and changes that have to go along with that so that that muscle mass gets a better oxygen supply, which we kind of talked about a little bit with the hematocrit last time, or not last time, but with the blood lab. Okay. So I want to talk about these other things a little bit more, and in the book, actually, they so let me just, as I'm going by this real quick, this is just showing the connections from the medulla, where there's a region called the cardiovascular center that affects heart rate and other aspects of what's going on in the heart. And this is just showing the connections there. Okay. And then this is a figure that pretty much every book has and every book messes up. This is normal or resting heart rate. And then they show how the sympathetic system can slow that down and how the parasympathetic system can slow that down and the sympathetic system can speed that up. It's not right. This should represent resting heart rate. This should represent the SA node beating on its own. So ignore the numbers here. Just pretend this top one is about 100 beats per minute. The parasympathetic system slows that down to resting heart rate of about 75 beats per minute. And the sympathetic system can speed that up above 100 beats per minute, like when you're exercising or something like that. But pretty much every book I've ever looked at, they've messed this particular figure up. So somebody back a long time ago made this figure wrong, and every textbook has kind of copied the figure and gotten the same problems in it. So the idea is just that you can slow down the heart through the parasympathetic activity, you can speed it up through sympathetic activity. Okay, so, and this is talking a little bit about what influences the cardiovascular center in the medulla. Come on. I thought there was a figure in here. Oh, yeah, here. So after all the text that explains this, there's a couple of figures that I want to show that address this. The first one, come on, just a table laying out the things that affect stroke volume. And the big things are preload, contractility, and afterload. Now, we're talking about cardiac muscle, but preload actually is just something that affects muscle in general. If you stretch muscle out a little bit before it contracts, it'll be able to contract more forcefully. And this just has to do with the structure of a sarcomere. So if my fingers here represent the overlapping thick and thin filaments, when your muscles contract, and this applies to skeletal or cardiac muscles, the thin filaments slide across the thick filaments and the sarcomere gets narrower. Okay? And that creates contraction. But there's a limit. It's going to have to stop when the thin filaments hit the middle of the sarcomere. If you stretch the sarcomere out first, then there's more space for the thin filaments to slide, and you get more forceful contraction out of it. Okay? Now, if you stretch out the sarcomere too much and the thick and thin filaments are no longer overlapping, then you're not going to get any contraction. But up to a point, you can stretch out the muscle a little bit and get more contraction. You can see that basically in how forceful somebody can throw a ball, whether they're just sort of tossing it out like this, or if they're really stretching out the muscles and throwing it. Okay. I used to have pictures showing I think it was Miss Team Detroit throwing the first ball out at a minor league game. I don't know why I picked that one, but it was a picture that came up on a Google search. And she's just throwing the ball like that. Versus one of the members of the Team USA women's softball team, and she's really winding up. And so she's able to throw, well, she's not throwing overhand because it's softball, but she's able to throw a much more forceful pitch because she's stretching the muscle out before she's contracting. Okay, that's preload. In terms of the heart, it basically means that you stretch the wall of the heart out before it contracts. The way you do that is by filling the heart with more blood. So anything that increases filling time, or I should say, anything that speeds up filling time or increases the amount of blood that fills the ventricle is going to stretch out the wall, which will then mean a higher end diastolic volume. And if the bigger number goes up, then the difference goes up too. Okay. And then there's a number of things that can inhibit that, and you get a decrease in stroke volume. Contractility is different from what I just talked about. I just said that the sarcomere can be stretched out so it can contract more. Contractility means that there's more calcium on hand so that contraction lasts longer or happens quicker. Okay. Oh, here's where glucagon shows up. It's not about heart rate, it's about contractility here. But anyways, a number of things can actually increase calcium flow into the cell, and that's going to increase contractility there. And if the heart muscle contracts more, then you're going to eject more blood, and systolic volume goes down, and that means stroke volume goes up. And then some things that can interfere with that, which are mostly things that interfere with well, sympathetic activity or calcium flow. Hyperkalemia is an increased potassium concentration, and potassium can interfere with calcium movement. And then the last one is afterload. We can actually affect preload and contractility, whether it's through our autonomic or endocrine systems. Afterload, we really don't have a lot of control over. Really what it means is high blood pressure. If the pressure in the aorta is high, then the isovolumetric contraction time is going to be longer and less blood's going to be ejected. Okay. Now we do have ways to lower blood pressure for the short term. So if you have a spike in blood pressure because you were just frightened or something like that, you have mechanisms to lower blood pressure immediately. But when you have chronic blood pressure, your system just adapts to it, and you no longer have the ability to get back to the normal blood pressure. Okay, your autonomic system and your endocrine system both say, well, if you're going to eat that much red meat, we're going to go ahead and stick with the 140 over 20, 140 over 90 blood pressure, and they don't try to do any better than that. And that kind of afterload makes it harder for your heart to pump blood out, and so less is going to come out with each heartbeat, and so end diastolic volume is higher, which means that stroke volume is lower. Okay, less gets pumped out, and then if your blood pressure is lower, then of course it's going to do the opposite. Okay. This picture kind of puts the previous picture together with the stuff that's kind of suggested by that table I just mentioned there. So we have cardiac output, heart rate, and stroke volume. When we go back here, heart rate, stroke volume, all of that's the same as I closed the picture, but the first picture I was showing you. Now we're actually seeing relationships between things that lead to this. And preload, contractility, afterload are all going in here, and they can have an effect on end diastolic volume or end systolic volume, which will change stroke volume. And these are the sorts of things that can have an effect on those. Venous return, that just means how much blood gets pumped back to the heart. And you actually store a little extra blood in your veins so that when you need to, you can easily send more blood back to your heart without having to increase blood volume. It's just sitting there in reserve to be pumped on. That'll also have an effect on heart rate, partly through the atrial reflex, which is when the atrial wall stretches, it automatically is going to try to lower heart rate and lower blood pressure, because when it stretches, that means that heart rate or heart pressure must be too high. So venous return can kind of counteract itself, but these things kind of fall into it. Yeah.
So you had mentioned just in regards to preload is due to the, well, elasticity.
No, I wouldn't exactly say elasticity, just stretch.
Well, stretch it. Just one factor I'm thinking of just in regard anatomically to stretch. I mean, with every material has like an innate modulus of elasticity, right? So I'm just wondering anatomically what would prevent the full stretch during preload. I mean, what inhibitions? I mean, what would inhibit structurally? Just the cardiac tissue in and of itself, containing that full ability to stretch. In some cases, like say, like I don't know, it's as a tangent, say cardiomyopathy, the ventricle can't perfuse blood efficiently because it's enlarged, so it kind of loses the strength of contraction.
Well, so right here, I think gets to some of what you're getting at, not so much the physical characteristics you're talking about, but these are all things that make preload less. Okay, and so you won't get that kind of increased contraction out of the sarcomere. Now, another way, I think, to kind of answer what you're asking, when you're talking about the modulus of elasticity and stuff like that, This is dependent on the sarcomere. The tissue can stretch a certain amount, but eventually the thin filaments will be removed from the sarcomere and they won't overlap with thick filaments. And so if you stretch too far, it causes problems. And
Right.
the less you stretch, then the less space for the sarcomeres to contract. Now, sarcomeres have built into them elasticity in the form of the titin molecules, which are kind of spring-like things that push the Z discs away from the thick filaments during relaxation. So there's always going to be some sort of stretch depending. I mean, an empty heart is going to just naturally contract up a little bit. And when you put heart blood into it, it'll stretch a little bit. But what this is talking about is you can increase that stretch and therefore increase the contraction up to a certain point by filling the heart more and therefore stretching the tissue out even more. And I mean, as far as what you're talking about is the physical properties, you said any elastic substance has a modulator, that sort of thing. We don't need to get concerned with that kind of description because this is all within the parameters of that sort of thing. And so we can just ignore that physical property because if we go past that, then the heart's just going to have bigger problems. So these are the things kind of summarize all of these ideas back together. Let's see. And then these tables are just pointing out a few things that kind of play into examples of what's going on there. Top here. I don't really deal with development of the heart too much, other than what I said earlier. Fetal heart has an atrial opening, and that's supposed to close around the time of birth. But other than that, I don't really deal with development of the heart too much. I don't deal with the development of much of anything too much. We were really more concerned with what's going on with the mature, normal adult situation. So I'll talk about developmental issues when it's relevant, like an atrial septal defect or something like that. So that's a quick run through of things. As far as what I did for my day class, my earlier lecture, I actually didn't get past, where was I? I was somewhere in the middle of this stuff here. So if it does post correctly, it won't go through everything that I just ran through quickly, but on Tuesday, I'm going to finish that with them. So go on a little bit more in-depth discussion of some of these things. If it worked successfully today, it'll be there, and I'll have more next week. And if it doesn't work, I've kind of hit some of the high points, the stuff that I want you to pay attention to, and you can get more out of the book, and you can do a little searching further afield, look for YouTube videos that might address these kind of things, that kind of thing, which is the nature of this particular type of course. So that brings us to the blood vessels part. And starting at 1 o'clock, I usually want to take a break somewhere in the neighborhood of 2:20 or so. It is not quite there, but this is a nice natural place to take a break. So we'll stop now, we'll take a break, we'll come back, and the rest of the day, today's class will deal with blood vessels. So I have 2:13 on the clock up here. Be back in here by 2:30, 2:35, somewhere in there, about 15, 20 minutes. And we'll get started with the rest of this.